This is the 710 axis from Benchmade in M4 steel. I've been carrying it for quite some time, and it's being the companion piece to my main EDC blade, which is a modulator from RJ Martin. Very similar knives, and both of them have powdered metallurgy steel. This is stainless S110V. Both of them have light recurves. This is an integral frame lock, and the 710 is an axis lock. One of the interesting differences is the recurve. The 710 recurves down in this area, has the hollow, but then actually comes up at the end right here, curves back up again. On the modulator, it actually goes flat in this area. It sort of curves down, but then again comes flat. It doesn't curve back up. And that makes this much better for straight push and power cuts. The only advantage to having this upsweep or upcurve right here is when you're actually cutting away from you and material ramps up on this. That's where you get the power of recurve, when the material is ramping up on it. But that's relatively rare. And for me personally, this would be better if it was flat, and I think I may flatten that all the way back. The modulator isn't perfect though. Down towards the end here, as I've said before, about 3/8 of this are not actually sharpened, and I'm probably going to end up putting some kind of choil notch there so I can sharpen it all the way back, and that's most likely that's what I'm going to end up doing. Another issue is that this has sort of the lightning strike carbon fiber pattern in the handle, and what was surprising to me is that the lightning strike part of it, those little metal, the lathe, actually is coming out, and I've lost probably around 10 to 15% of it so far, and it just pops out, and those little metal bits just sort of stick off, and every now and again one of them sort of catches in your hand and you just peel it off. See, there's one starting to come off right here, and another day or so that will be off enough that it will catch and then pop out. Bit surprised to see that happen. The main reason that I made this video is something rather surprising happened when I was using the 710 for some, decently heavy use. I found that after about 50 or so relatively heavy cuts, the pivot would back out enough that the blade would develop both lateral and up and down play. Now, as Cody from CKC Knives has argued a bunch of times, which is a perfectly fine argument, slight amount of blade play isn't critical in regards to use, and lots of really well-known and well-respected working knives, such as the Swiss Army knives, have small amount of play. So I continued using it with a small amount of play. I was kind of curious if I would notice any functional difference, and I really wasn't. It is a bit disconcerting though when you're using a relatively high-end knife and you're feeling the blade sort of move around a little bit. However, the lock actually collapsed during the cutting, which I mean by that, the blade actually released. That was relatively surprising. So I took it off, cleaned it all up, and by some rather simple experiments was able to figure out what was happening is that when the pivot backed off and the blade developed that lateral and vertical play, any loads on the spine then, even relatively light ones, could cause the blade to release. And it would essentially unlock. What was happening was that somehow, because of the fact that the blade had this play, that a vertical load on the blade could put a lateral load on the stop pin and cause it to release. That's kind of interesting, and I didn't expect it. I have first generation RSK from Doug Ritter in one of the earliest runs of S30V. Decent knife, horrible steel. One of the worst executions of a modern stainless that I've seen. It was a replacement for a defective knife, which also turned out to be horribly defective. Have no idea what they were doing with S30V when it first came out. I believe now, as I believed back then, one of the main things was that they're horrendously burning the steel, because it was one of the first times that they used a very high vanadium steel, and they're not trivial to grind, especially if you grind them after heat treatment, which you generally don't want to do anyway. In any case, the RSK is really well used. It has been reground a bunch of times because of thickening of the edge from sharpening, and the pivot doesn't back out very easy, and the lock isn't actually unstable if you do loosen up the pivot. So I'm going to get that back off my brother, have a look at both of them, take them apart and see if I can't sort of figure out what's going on, because this isn't terribly useful for me if the lock is insecure, if the pivot loosens up, and the pivot loosens up very dramatically, very fast, unless of course you put thread locker on it. So kind of disappointed in that, because overall it's a relatively decent knife. The biggest problem I have with it is the horrible inconsistency in the design in using a steel like powder metallurgy version of M4 and then putting a 20 degree per side edge on it. You're using a steel which has the stability to hold a lower edge angle, but giving it a higher one. That doesn't make any sense. If you're going to use relatively high angles like 20 degrees per side, you could have went with the much less expensive D-series steels, which also have extremely high wear resistance. The main reason that you don't use those is because the primary carbide aggravates can be so huge it forces you to either use very large edge angles or put up with that sort of very aggressive self-fracturing type edge that you get when you get low edge angles. So why use this steel and not slim the edge out and the angle reduced significantly? Now, not a big issue to solve, of course. I can regrind this, put a much lower edge angle on it. I was considering for a while leaving this relatively stock as sort of a benchmark point of comparison, but there's enough sort of issues with it that I think I am going to modify it somewhat. And of course, once you do start modifying it, you can't really use it as a point of comparison in that anymore. And I am really curious to see how the M4 in this compares to the Spyderco M4 in the Air. So I'm probably going to end up regrinding this to full flat grind and taking this upsweep off the edge right there and dramatically thin out the edge, bring it down to under 5 thousandths per side, and put say 10 degree per side edge bevel on. I may even go a bit lower than that because the Air is a bit lower than that now, only by a few degrees or so.